Hello everybody and welcome to this afternoon's session on Reset TV, which is entitled What is Real Security and Why is the Peace Movement Important in XR? And your host for this session is Angie Zelter.
Hello everybody, thanks for joining us. I just wanted to explain to you why XR Peace was set up. XR Peace was set up to fill a glaring gap in the climate change debates. The general public were not aware of the huge impact of militarization on the environment and the climate. The USA, although never ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, had managed to opt out from having to report or act on the armed forces' greenhouse gas emissions. Thus, military-related emissions were excluded by some of the largest polluters from the global north to avoid jeopardizing their lucrative arms and military aid contracts. We've learned quite recently, for instance, that the UK military and arms companies produce more carbon emissions than 60 individual countries. Deploying combat planes, warships and tanks, and the use of overseas military bases, all of those things are highly energy intensive and dependent on fossil fuels. Moreover, the UK arms industry, with BAE Systems being the largest, emits 1.46 million tonnes of carbon dioxide annually, a level similar to the emissions of all domestic flights in the UK. Similar to all the emissions of the domestic flights in the UK, lots of people don't even know that. Thus, in August 2019, peace movement organisations started to join XR Peace. We were only just ready in time to take part in the October 2019 rebellion, where 75 of us occupied the Victoria Embankment at 6 a.m. on the 7th of October, and the arrest started. After 9 climate not war actions over the 2 weeks, 57 peace activists had been arrested outside the Ministry of Defence, BAE Systems headquarters, the Supreme Court, and in Trafalgar Square. We now have 14 organisations supporting XR Peace, including Trident Ploughshares, Nukewatch, CND, War Resisters International, the Iona Community, to name just a few. We support the overall aims of XR, and we aim to raise awareness of the role of militarism and war in the climate crisis, and to demand that resources that go to the military be used instead to address the climate emergency. But what are the links between the military and climate change? We often say that climate change causes war and war causes climate change. And I hope that this live chat with some of our XR Peace people will unwrap this headline. But briefly, militarism is a central pillar of the extractive systems causing climate change. Instead of a fair and equitable global trading system, the so-called free trade system ensures that a tiny number of people profit at the expense of the majority. The pillaging of resources for profit destroys communities and contaminates environments all over the world. When locals protest as their forests are cut down or their lands and water sources are polluted by mining, oil extraction or plantations, the military or private security forces brutally back up the companies involved. In the process, our fragile planet is being destroyed along with a mass extinction of other species. There are at least 26 wars and armed conflicts raging today, and many of the armed conflicts are actually resource wars over oil, water, minerals, land. They are about control and the abuse of power. About 6% of global carbon emissions are from military activity, and $1,917 billion was spent on the military globally in 2019, wasted funds that could have gone into health and real security. Climate change itself is already a significant cause of conflicts and a key factor driving the refugee crisis. There are at least 7.8 million refugees and forcibly displaced people in the world today. As the climate crisis increases, there will be even greater tension, and unless we work hard, there will be more wars, more refugees, and increasing racism and militarized borders. Additionally, the risk of nuclear war is increasing as international relations deteriorate and conflicts increase with the deepening climate crisis. The use of just a fraction of the nuclear weapons deployed globally could result in a nuclear winter, leading to global famine and the death of 2 billion people. As long as countries continue to prepare for and resort to war as a means of solving conflict, we will not be able to address the climate change. All people of the earth face a common threat. To avert catastrophe, we must put aside narrow national self-interest and think of ourselves as global citizens working together to save our shared home. So I'd like to introduce you to some of our XR Peace people. So firstly, David Collins. Hello and welcome, David. After serving 9 years in the Royal Marines, he worked in renewable energy, and he's now active in the movement for the abolition of war and Veterans for Peace. David, I'm wondering whether you could assess for us the security risks within the Ministry of Defence.
Certainly. Can I just quickly mention what Veterans for Peace is? It's
yes, do.
Formed in the USA in 1985 and has over 100 chapters in the USA and a growing number of other chapters around the world. It's a voluntary and politically independent ex-services organization of men and women who have served in conflicts from World War II through to Afghanistan. And we say that war is not the solution to the problems we face in the 21st century. And just briefly, I'm moving on to the abolition of war. That was founded in 2001 by Professor Rotblat and Bruce Kent, who is currently the Vice President and also Vice President of CND. And also our new president is Professor Paul Rogers, who is Emeritus Professor of Peace Studies at Bradford University. We're guided by the first line of the preamble of the Charter of the UN of 26th of June 1945. We, the peoples of the United Nations, are determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. Sorry, to return to your question. The security risk at MOD. A report by the Oxford Research Group has established that MOD advice to policymakers is governed by the principle even a 1% chance of a security risk materializing is unacceptable. This goes a long way to explain the need for such immense sums spent by the military. With a large or small, fictitious or true, a tiny security threat means more ships for the Navy, more tanks, more aircraft, just to make us safe. It also creates the public anxiety that is necessary to complete the triangle composed of the military and public opinion that legitimizes ministers to continue to support military expenditure. But one irony noted by Dr. Leila Urakanova while at the 2018 Munich Security Conference is that this 1% doctrine is for all practical purposes identical to the precautionary principle invoked by environmentalists, yet the certainty of impending climate catastrophe is ignored in favor of the possibility of security threats. Because the unfolding climate catastrophe is not a 1% or a 20% or even a 90% risk. At the time in the near future, it is plainly 100%. The basic facts of the science have been indisputable for over 40 years. International climate finance, which is the commitment, the important commitment by developed countries, including the UK, to support global action to manage the impacts of climate change, for instance, biodiversity and deforestation, represents overwhelmingly a better value than military action towards the mitigation of conditions in the world. However, it is lower than national military spending by an average ratio of 12 to 1. In the case of the USA, it is 0.2% of military spending, that is the international climate finance. Italy 0.9, UK 3. Yet Germany manages over 22%, Japan 18, and this is directly related to the fact that their foreign policies of each country, their constitutions forbid them to engage in aggressive wars, releasing all these funds for what has now been hailed as the two most successful economies since the World War II. Just to finish with that, spending on the Iraq war alone could cover all global investments in renewable energy needed to halt global warming trends in the period to 2030. No regret for any of these wars has ever been shown by government. To the contrary, Gavin Williamson, the former Defence Secretary, stated in December 2018, the UK could build new military bases around the world after Brexit. This is our moment to be that true global player once more, looking into new opportunities for the armed forces, our biggest moment as a nation since the Second World War. That incredible statement remains government policy.
God, that's horrendous, isn't it? It really is. Well, we'd rather go to war than do something about climate change. Have you got any comments to make about the current recruitment of young people into the armed forces? And can you say something about the war school film?
Certainly. Well, the fact is, in the UK, young people of 15 years and 7 months are allowed to make an application to the army or any of the armed forces and begin their training at the age of 16. Then they must serve in the army for 4 more years until the age of 22. And this is the only country in Europe that recruits children for the army. Of course, it's well known that other children are forced into that horrible business in other countries. But Armed Forces Day, Uniform to Work Day, Camo Day, National Heroes Day, in the streets, on television, on the web, at sports events and schools, advertising, fashion, the military presence in civil life is on the march. And the public and ever younger children are being groomed to collude in the increasing militarization of society. So War School is produced independently by a producer called Mick Dixon. It's currently available to watch free on YouTube, 82 minutes long. It's about the battle for the hearts and minds of Britain's children. And Veterans for Peace members form much of the cast with first-hand accounts of battle experiences in many wars. But one of the centerpieces is of the film. It's set against the backdrop of the Remembrance Day parade at the Cenotaph. And the documentary says, faced with unprecedented opposition to its walls, the British government is using a series of new strategies to promote support for the military. And as Ben Griffin said, he's the founder of Veterans for Peace, Remembrance Day is a misnomer. It's not remembrance, it's concealment about the true nature of war. So we march each year under a banner with just 2 words chosen by the generation that fought in the First World War: never again. And this was the unsaid covenant between the dead and those who survived. And no group except VFP now carries that banner at that ceremony. And as we march, we think of people, both military and civilian, that we knew and who have died, who suffer physically from war. The one thing, the only thing that could possibly make any sense of the deaths of many millions is work to secure what they yearned for: permanent peace. Yet our prime ministers attend the ceremony and from there go straight back to Downing Street and do none of the things that are necessary to avoid more wars.
Thank you, David. Does anybody else want to comment on some of David's comments? I'd just like to remind you all that the peace movement on Remembrance Day often go to their local war memorials with white poppies, sometimes with a few red poppies in, but basically trying to talk about all the victims of war. And then the other thing to mention is that August the 6th to the 9th are the anniversaries of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so again, the peace movement and hopefully XR Peace will be doing things around that. So 75 years now since nuclear weapons were first used.
I just think it's really important that there are former Marines and service people who, you know, have served on the front line, who are taking the kind of position that David takes, recognizing that security isn't about, you know, being able to fight wars that are frankly the 20th century or 19th century wars. It's not about those things, that our security is actually about the issues that we're facing today, which climate and the pandemic now are, you know, examples of where the government is not following policies that would make us more secure. So I just want to thank David for all that you're doing to work among ex-service people, because we spend quite a lot of time talking with them, and they really are thinking about these issues, but they're in the military now and they have to follow what the government tells them to prioritize.
Yes, and one of the other things we do is pastoral work with those suffering from PTSD and ex-service people, because quite a few are members of us because they want to talk to other people who share similar experiences. They wish to use their experiences, you mentioned, to try and stop this madness continuing. The thing is, regimental loyalty is so strong that all of us are quite unpopular with the previous arms that we served with. But when you come to talk to even people at Remembrance Sunday who are jangling with medals and very proud and not thinking of what we should be doing to stop war, they quite often say, well, you've got a point there. You really have. And there's never any aggro, let's say, between the two sides. It's quite extraordinary how when face to face, they will say, well, actually, perhaps I do need to pop out of this bubble.
Thank you. I think we'll move on now to Rebecca. Rebecca's a feminist, peace and environmental activist, was the co-founding first president of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and she's currently the spokesperson on security, peace and defence for the Green Party of England and Wales. So welcome, Rebecca. Why do you connect banning nuclear weapons with environmental and climate issues?
Hi, thank you. Yes. Well, banning nuclear weapons is something that obviously we've, had the objective of for many years. But how many people in this country actually know that in 2017, the United Nations actually negotiated multilaterally this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons? And that is actually the treaty that ICAN, which is a network of organizations in over 500 countries, over 550 organizations across a whole range of humanitarian and not just peace and environmental issues in over 100 countries. And that's what ICAN as a whole were given the Nobel Peace Prize for in 2017. But this treaty is really came about because we wanted to get away from all that tech stuff that the militarists who keep on building and making more and more nuclear weapons would get stuck in, this notion of so-called nuclear deterrence, where the more nuclear weapons you have somehow is supposed to keep you safer, which everybody deep down knows is nonsense. So we reached out, and climate scientists were updating studies that had been done back in the 1980s, the last time when people of my generation were out on the streets and at Greenham Common and places like that to try to stop nuclear war. And the climate scientists got together with the doctors, people like Alan Robock and Ira Helfand in the States, and they put together the data again for today. And they found that if just a tiny, tiny fraction of the nuclear weapons in the world, or to give it some reality, if just half of the nuclear weapons held by India and Pakistan, or just the nuclear warheads on one UK Trident submarine were to be fired and detonated on cities, that would create something called nuclear winter, because it would create massive, it would not just sort of just kill millions in those cities through fire and blast and radiation, but it would also create a dust cloud that would circulate around the Earth for so many years. It would create nuclear freezing quite abruptly, and by the way, and nuclear winter. And nuclear winter is not an answer to climate heating, because just like climate heating, what actually goes on, it totally disrupts everybody's climate systems. People would not be able to grow food. And the estimates are that within a decade of just the warheads on one UK Trident nuclear submarine used on cities somewhere like, Russia or China or wherever they're currently talking about as the major threat, that would cause actually starvation of up to 2 billion people all around the world. And on top of that, if you bring into account the kinds of issues that certainly were the reason why I went to Greenham Common in the 80s, which was the recognition that every stage of making, nuclear power and nuclear energy, nuclear power and nuclear weapons is incredibly contaminating, incredibly polluting, from uranium mining through to production, through to nuclear testing. And then, of course, I've just spoken about what, if God forbid, nuclear weapons were ever used, what would be the global consequences. And that contamination was done in places like the Aboriginal land in Australia, the Western Shoshone First Nation lands in Nevada, in Kazakhstan by the Soviet Union in those days, in the Uyghur areas of China. So indigenous people were first and foremost harmed already by pollution and contamination, radioactive contamination, just from making nuclear weapons. So that's why we say that these are connected. And this treaty is so important because what it actually does, and it was adopted by 122 of the UN General Assembly countries, shamefully, the UK and a few others actually boycotted the multilateral negotiations. But nevertheless, the treaty was adopted. It was open for signature. I think it's got 81 signatures so far. It's got 38 ratifications. So when the 50th country ratifies, the treaty will actually enter into full legal force internationally. And what it does is it prohibits the development, the production, manufacture, the testing, the transferring, the deployment of nuclear weapons, everything that actually leads up to using nuclear weapons, but it also explicitly prohibits using and threatening to use nuclear weapons. And then it goes on and talks about what you have to do then if you're like the UK with nuclear weapons, how to eliminate those nuclear weapons safely and securely. So that's where we are now. That is a treaty that we have to get the UK to join. And the final point I just want to make is it is a humanitarian treaty. It's got feminist and humanitarian principles. And I'm going to read to you just one paragraph from the preamble, because that helps you understand why this treaty actually understands why we have to have XR to address climate chaos and destruction. This treaty is because of the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons cannot be addressed adequately. They transcend national borders. They pose grave implications for human survival, the environment, socio-economic development, the global economy, food security, and the health of current and future generations. And they have a disproportionate impact on women and girls, including as a result of ionizing radiation. The treaty also recognizes the disproportionate impact on indigenous people, on the poor, on developing nations. Only 9 countries in the world actually have nuclear weapons, and yet they are putting the whole world at danger in the same way. And those 9 countries, by the way, are the major climate destroyers as well. The military-industrial production that has led us to the brink of climate collapse is also those bringing us to the brink of nuclear annihilation, and that's why they're connected.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. Given that we're right in the middle of the COVID crisis, how do you think that affects the issues of peace, security and defence and climate justice? And what can we do to persuade governments, especially here in the UK, with a government that just doesn't seem to take any notice of anything sensible? I mean, we're all just scratching our head and think, God, why can't you deal with things? Why can't you change? Why can't you use this opportunity to make the incredible changes that we need to make? What do you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, the first question to say is, how come, since, pandemics like this coronavirus COVID-19 crisis regularly for at least the last 20 years, and in some cases in some countries more, but even in this country, has come top or very near the top of the security threats that the governments themselves, their own documents talk about. And yet we were totally unprepared for this. Why? Because they were looking in the wrong direction. They still think of security as a national security issue that has to do with having more weapons than others, weapons capabilities, by being prepared to fight, wars that belong in the past centuries, and the projection of power internationally. That's what they think of as national security, and it just isn't. We live in an interconnected world where if something goes wrong in one country, it requires that we all take care of what is going wrong, whether that's, mad leaders threatening each other with nuclear weapons, as are happening in 2 or 3 areas, I mean, not least with Trump in the White House, or whether it's, a pandemic and so on. So the first thing is to say, what are the real threats? And they have that answer themselves. But then it is to say, so what do we do about those threats? How do we prepare? Now, that's a resource issue. They needed to think in terms of preparing by having, all the PPE, the equipment, all the hospital equipment, all the, the ventilators. They were told what they would need. And a previous government had actually stored some of that stuff. And the last 2 governments basically either let them go out of date or emptied out the warehouses. So why these are connected, and then what we can do about them, is that it's our job to say, look, our security is the things that keep us alive, our families alive, that provide us with good, safe, secure and environmental jobs, that provide us with an ability to interact with other countries so that we can all work together on the major threats like climate destruction. So that's what we need to be calling for. Now, as I mentioned, this government has not got very good policies across the board on any of these issues, and didn't even bother to go to the multilateral negotiations by the UN on banning nuclear weapons, although that's completely within our security interests. But at the moment, they're refusing to sign. And we can't force the government to resign. We can try to elect better governments, but now we've not got that chance even for 5 years. But what we can do is in our own local areas. So XR Peace is about both being out on the streets, linking all of these peace and security issues with climate destruction, because they are inextricably linked, and also informing people and working in our local areas with our local XR groups and so on. We've put up a series of leaflets on XR Peace website that deal precisely with some of these issues. The first leaflet that, I wrote, we all talked about the kind of leaflets we wanted, and then we kind of parceled out some of the tasks, was on unpreparedness and COVID, but we've also got leaflets on the nuclear issue, on the treaty, on ceasefire. The UN Secretary General has called for a ceasefire, and they are quite short, and they give you just potted arguments, plus there are other resources. Take a look, inform people. It's the kind of thing, and it's written in sort of language that, your kids can take to school and talk about, and or your kids can bring back from school, or you can educate your parents about. But also with relation, say, to a number of these issues, we can do things in our own towns and villages. A number of towns are declaring that they will do their best to apply this nuclear ban treaty, that they won't invest in the military, and in particular, they won't invest in nuclear weapons in their pension funds or anything else. So towns, cities like, Manchester and Edinburgh have already signed on to that. Find out if your city has and sign them on. Your own Don't Bank on the Bomb is a great initiative of ICANN that really pushes the argument among banks and among, investors and so on. Don't bank on nuclear weapons, because when this treaty enters into force, it's going to be illegal to do that. So there's those kinds of things, but it's really be aware, connect up this military side when you're doing climate actions, and connect up climate actions when you're thinking about peace and security. And contact us, and we can talk to you about further things that can be done. I'm sure others who are going to speak after me have ideas for. I know Janet from Scotland's got loads of ideas because she implements them up in Scotland. So that's probably where I can leave it.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Yeah, I mean, we do live in the UK, which is includes other countries like Scotland and Wales, and so we've got coming up now somebody from Wales, Brian Jones, who's a former mathematics teacher, a long-term anti-nuclear and environmental activist. He's vice chair of CND Cymru, as well as being the unpaid director of a local renewable energy cooperative. So I wanted to ask you, Brian, what's the same and what's different about the nuclear threat and the climate crisis in Wales?
Well, obviously, some of the details are different and the threats are essentially the same, and the actions that are required are essentially the same. We're, in some ways, we're quite fortunate, as Scotland is, and I'm sure Janet will say more about the Scottish situation. In the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd is currently led by the Labour Party, with Plaid Cymru pushing for greener and more community-based values, I would say. Obviously, the geography of Wales is different to the geography of England in particular. We've got very long coastline and we get lots and lots of rain, so we're very suitably placed for lots of hydropower, small-scale hydropowers, and lots of tidal power. And there was a recent announcement of a new tidal power scheme being trialled in Milford Haven, which we're very pleased to see. The Welsh Government, although I don't agree with it on everything, but by any means, has been very supportive of community energy, and that's completely different from the situation in England. So much so that Wales now generates more electricity than we consume, and we export the rest. That's without now any nuclear generation and without any coal power generation. That situation is completely different from the situation in England, where it's been particularly difficult to get projects involving wind turbines past planning permission. Having said that, there are still, as you would imagine, a load of people and a load of politicians and a large section of the Welsh Assembly who still want to see economic growth and jobs at all costs, and we still face the same sort of arguments there. We're trying to persuade them that that jobs at any cost is just totally unacceptable. We've got to find jobs which provide employment, but also promote sustainability, both in Wales and globally. So it's a mix, isn't it? Some of it's the same, some of it's different. We also have, because of the relative strength of the Welsh language and the Welsh language media, we often have a second output for getting our arguments across, which provides a bit more breadth for the debate, I would say, than I used to be aware of when I lived in England. There's a lot to be done, but we're working on it as best we can.
Thanks, Brian. How would successful resistance to the military presence in Wales help mitigate the climate crisis? And I mean, you haven't said anything about the drones and the military technology and places in Wales which are kind of military sites. If you could kind of elucidate some of that for us, that would be quite useful, because I don't think many people understand much about that.
Okay, yeah, well, just like anywhere else, I mean, obviously, the more we can reduce the military's operations, the more money will be released for alternatives, the more resources, and importantly, the more human ingenuity. I mean, if we could harness some of the brains that have gone behind developing the most sophisticated weaponry in the world to develop socially useful things, we'd be in a completely different place. And we have to bear in mind that the Ministry of Defence carbon footprint is larger than the 60 countries in the world, the 60 with the smallest carbon footprint, admittedly, and is roughly equivalent to 6 million cars on the UK roads. So it's a big chunk of carbon footprint. There's a tract of land called the Epent, just above Brecon and below Llanuwchllyn Wells, Bilthwells, that sort of area. Now that's a huge area of land, and 80 years ago, 219 people were told, we want your land, essentially. They were moved, the entire community was broken up, 54 households, school, church, pub, all closed down for the Ministry of Defence to move in to train for the Second World War. And as you might have imagined, the Second World War ends and the military still uses that land today. It's the third largest military training area in the UK, 40 square miles. And you know, even if we just got a couple of square miles back, every square mile could easily be planted with indigenous trees that could take 100,000 tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere just like that. So there's those sort of opportunities. There are other big military land holdings in Wales as well, but that's the biggest by far. The drones, well, Aberporth on the West Wales coast is the UK's only centre of excellence for unmanned aerial vehicles, drones as everyone else calls them. They've got a huge flying area, 500 square miles over land and another 2,000 square miles over the sea. The idea was that they'd become a major employer in the area, and a huge amount of money has been poured into the project, and it still probably employs less than 20, 30 people maximum. On the plus side, they are all unarmed. They're used for training pilots to fly these things. They're not used to training them for using them to kill people. That's done in Canada. But there have been 5 drone crashes so far, and I mean, each one cost £15 million. So, you know, it's the only site in Europe where drones are allowed to fly out of eyesight, which obviously they need to do if drones are going to do what they're doing, but that does involve extra dangers. There's been talk recently about opening a second drone flight place in northwest Wales in Llanbedr. That's at very early stages, but it looks likely. There's been attempts there before. Last time they attempted it, there was a fairly significant civil disobedience action there that gained a lot of publicity, and a couple of people went to court and so on. But eventually, the military backed down for a couple of years, and it does seem like it's coming back again.
Thank you, Brian. That reminds me how important sustained civil resistance is. You know, you get the odd demonstration or something happens on all sorts of different issues. The government or the company backs down for a while, then it comes back, and it keeps coming back and back. And if you don't sustain the resistance, you don't get the results that you really need. So that's an encouragement for all of us to sustain the civil resistance.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you. Maybe we could go to Scotland now. Janet Fenton. She's a Quaker feminist active in Secure Scotland, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Scottish CND, and the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Janet, are you there? I can't see you at the moment.
I'm here.
Oh, great. I'm glad you're there. Janet, what makes Scotland so special? Dealing with the nuclear threat and the climate crisis.
Well, obviously, the most particularly special thing that Scotland has is 200 nuclear bombs, 25 miles from our major city. So that makes it, that focuses the mind somewhat. And the Ministry of Defence transports these. I love this leaflet. I'm going to read it because it's just so short and good. It says, there are 200 nuclear bombs 25 miles from Glasgow. The Ministry of Defence transports these nuclear weapons by road through Glasgow, Edinburgh and Stirling. The government wants to spend £205 billion renewing it. In contrast, the Scottish Parliament wants nuclear weapons removed from our lochs and our hills, and Scottish CND campaigns to have these bombs removed from Scotland, scrapped, and be removed from the world. One way to do that would be if Scotland was independent, but there are other ways as well. And it was interesting listening to Brian because we have a lot in common, obviously. We have a lot in common in our energy and our resources for energy, which we can share with the rest of the world. And we certainly don't need nuclear power, and we can meet our own needs in that way. So that's one of the things that's special about Scotland. I think politically, it's important to recognise that there is this separate parliamentary system. There's a separate parliamentary system. There's a separate legal system. There's a separate education system, and they're actually better systems, particularly insofar as democracy is concerned, because the parliamentary system that we have in Scotland is by proportional representation. So we have a far less adversarial capacity within the Parliament than at Westminster, and that was set up. And some of us wanted it because it would be less adversarial and we might come to some common purpose, because those of us that do non-violence know that the way you resolve conflict is not to focus on what divides you, but to focus on what you've got in common and do that bit first and see if you find out that you've actually got a bit more in common. But it was also welcomed by those that wanted to maintain the democratic deficit that exists in Scotland from Westminster by not allowing any political party to get a proper majority. Well, that actually hasn't worked. So that's the political situation, and that's important. But there's also a very important cultural situation that is similar to what Brian was talking about with regard to the language. But I mean, Scotland's a tiny little country. There's only 5 million of us. So, and we understand each other. There's a cultural common lingua, even if it's not Gaelic or Lowland Scots. There's a frame of reference that we all understand. The way I like to describe it is we're all Jock Tamson's bairns in Scotland. And so there is a natural concern, at least aspirationally, with looking out for each other. And that's very much at the root of how we would like to frame security, because security is not doing things that endanger you, which is what having nuclear weapons and not addressing climate change, where that comes from. But I think it's much easier in Scotland to see the relationship between nuclear weapons and climate change, possibly, than it is elsewhere. We have this incredible military control over our country that we can't do anything about. Decisions are made by Westminster that we have absolutely no control over, even when we've got a completely universal representation on an issue from Scottish parliamentarians at Westminster. That still isn't going to actually deliver what Scottish people want. So, so part of the impact of that has meant that at one point it was a term was Fortress Scotland, and you'll remember, Angie, that book which showed every military installation the length of the land. And right now my heart is breaking for the wetlands of the Moyne, where they're talking about putting up this spaceport, and it's supposed to be civilian, and it's supposed to create jobs for 10 people up there. And it's Lockheed Martin creating another area and facility for damage. And they're talking about one of the most significant areas of wetland across the whole of Europe. It's the biggest natural wetland, bigger even than areas of Russia, and it will be destroyed by this thing. And we can't. How do we stop that from happening? It's but coming back to Angie's point about civil resistance, one of the ways in which we've achieved an informed parliament that is consistently saying no to nuclear weapons and consistently saying yes to a very ambitious climate bill was because of Faslane 365. And that campaign, where we used our networks, we used our international connections, and we built on that with the support of a really terrific support team that people like Angie and like Rebecca spent a year in the area, living in the shadow of the UK's nuclear arsenal, and made sure that there were demonstrations every day, so imaginative, so creative, and lots of good stuff to learn from. And the book's there, so get the book and get some ideas about things that you can do. Because I think one thing that's really important is to realize we can see that what happened with this COVID thing is that one thing is that they don't know what to do when something goes wrong. And something could so easily go wrong with nuclear weapons. And Rebecca has explained very clearly and cogently what a huge impact on the climate that would have. Any steps that we can take to remediate climate change could be obliterated irreversibly if there is a nuclear explosion. We've got to get rid of the nuclear weapons. But it's also because of the mentality that goes with them. So we did very well in this country over COVID because we gave our consent to have our civil liberties reduced. And we can withdraw our consent and make the country where nuclear weapons exist, my country, we can make it ungovernable. We could do that. I mean, it wouldn't really take an awful lot of people to make that happen. I'd just like to finish by saying a little thing about Cape Wrath, which is another huge area in the northerly and most beautiful part of my country. And I went to visit a man that has a little cafe on one side of Loch Erible, and you look across the loch and there's this wonderful seascape, and he has binoculars on the edges of the window of his cafe so that you can look at the seabirds. And on the cliff at the other side, there's a big white splodge. And I said to him, "What's that splodge?" He said, "Don't talk to me about that. That's the bloody military. They use that for target practice." And this guy is sitting in that place, looking at that every day. And so that's what resistance in Scotland is like, and there's lots to do. And I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Okay. Well, I'd like afterwards to come back and for you to say a little bit more about Nuke Watch, because that's something that people in England and Scotland can do, and we need many more people to look at those convoys. So could you just say a little bit about that and about Nuke Watch and about that amazing video, so if people want to recognise what a nuclear convoy looks like, they can get involved with that?
Yeah. Well, Nuke Watch is, we actually had a cross-party group in the Scottish Parliament this morning, and one of the topics was the work that Nuke Watch does. Nuke Watch is a UK-wide organisation but it's been particularly active in Scotland. And during the COVID, when a nuclear convoy carrying these warheads from the Coalport and Faslane complex down to Aldermaston was out on the road, it was the social media coverage of that was completely off the scale. You can see the links, you can see the films that were made by people on the Nukewatch, nukewatch.org, on their website. But we were tackling this politically as well. And one of the things that was done was a report was created by Jane Tallants and David Mackenzie, who, with one of the Scottish parliamentarians, asked questions about preparedness for a disaster, the disaster being a warhead falling off one of these lorries, or a crash, or some kind of accident, and what were the local authorities, what was their preparedness, and how would that be dealt with by the Scottish government. And basically the answer is that they trust the MOD to look after it. I mean, it's crazy. So that is an ongoing live discussion, and I mean, it's been able to take place because of the vast numbers of people that were prepared to go and sit at the side of a road after they've got a text message on their phone saying it might be coming on a road near you, and just go and watch for it and report it. And I mean, it provides evidence that can be used for that kind of parliamentary work. It also provides opportunities for direct action where it can be undertaken safely. And it also has, we've just been looking at the modernisation of the UK's nuclear weapons. And that's, I've just been involved in a report that's gone to, that will be used at the NPT for briefing diplomats about the modernisation of nuclear weapons. And a lot of the information in that is obtained by just tracking these convoys and by working out when they're moving and what they're moving and how many vehicles and so on and so forth. You can actually learn quite a lot about how the government's undertaking its top secret so-called modernisation program. So it has all sorts of really good uses. And it's a great thing to get involved with, and a great way to share stories and learn more about your fellow travellers on this action plan by getting involved with Nukewatch and becoming a tracker or sharing the story. But have a look at the film on the Nukewatch website.
Thank you very much, Janet. I can see time is pressing. I just want to say a little bit about militarisation as a whole. This isn't just about nuclear weapons. We waste so many resources on the military as a whole, but also the arms trade is so important. And we are one of the major arms dealers. Stop the War is part of our XR Peace coalition. They've got a great film coming up which we'll talk about, or they're going to be showing that. So look at the Stop the War website too for information about the arms trade. And I'm just wondering whether we've got any questions now in the last 5 minutes that we have that have come up from anybody, or that you would like to. Yes, Indigo, you said you've got something there?
Yes, there's lots of people watching at home, people really pleased that this talk is happening. Janice saying, I've never considered these things before, so thank you to the Veterans of Peace. And someone reminding us about white poppy-based ceremonies. And someone, Joseph, saying, if we keep up all the grassroots resistance and eventually persuade those countries to see sense and support the ban treaty. So lots of interesting chat happening, but the question I'm wondering is, how can local XR groups help the work of XR Peace?
Now that's quite an important question, especially for XR Peace, because many of us are members of our local XR groups, and of course they concentrate on regional actions and therefore don't feel that they have any spare energy to give to XR Peace. And so what we'd like to encourage people that are interested in XR Peace is stay with your local regional group, of course. But if you can get a little affinity group of people who are specifically interested in militarization and get a little affinity group ready to do actions against the British Aerospace, for instance, or the Ministry of Defence, or against drone warfare or whatever, then contact us because then we can have a discussion about the actions that we want to do. This does not have to take away from your regional XR group or your local group, but we need to build more affinity groups to do some very effective actions. So I'd really like to encourage people to try and get some affinity groups specifically for XR Peace.
And can I chip in as well here? Because I was part of Brighton and Hove XR Peace before, for the first part rebellion, before XR Peace was founded. And I think it was so inspiring also to be really connected in with a lot of young people who were coming out on the streets. And, being part is sort of a two-way thing. So, I as an older person was going out to support whenever the young people wanted support for the climate strike, their, Future for Fridays for Future and so on. And in return, as Angie said, there are specific things that can be done that connect up with XR Peace. One of the things is that when there is a big rebellion, XR Peace is probably, somewhere around the Ministry of Defence or the BAE headquarters. But also here in Brighton, for example, there's the Edo Arms manufacturing plant, and quite a lot of you will find, there's Rolls-Royce in Derby that does quite a lot of military and nuclear related stuff. Quite a lot of you will actually find that there are things near you that are military connected, where a lot of money is being spent on that and not on ameliorating the climate. So it's to kind of, become aware of that, but also, you've seen some of our faces now. Contact XR Peace, ask for a speaker, and by and large we'll try and send you a speaker who's actually already in your area to talk about some of these issues and just connect up with what what XR as a whole is doing, which is so interconnected, and then what can practically be done by linking up for certain things with XR Peace.
Great, yeah, that's a really interesting way forward. Oh,
could I just chip in?
Of course.
I just wanted to say that one of the things that we did in Scotland at the beginning was just reach out, and it's a two-way process. And there's a huge amount of overlap, and we had young people from the climate change movement talk to CND AGM, for example. That was one of the things that we did, and it was a real two-way conversation, and I think that's really necessary. And we've mentioned CND. There's all these groups that if you're in a local XR group, talk to peace people in your local area and see if you can't come up with some collaborative work that could be done as part of XR Peace. We can all communicate virtually, and we can communicate at a local level as well, and between the two processes we can inform each other, because there's a lot of people in CND that need to be more informed about climate action. There's a lot of people that are involved in Stop the War that need to be informed about the climate situation, and vice versa. So just making more connections.
And David, you wanted to have a last word?
30 seconds. The objectives: re-evaluation of the full meaning of sustainable security, inclusion of carbon emissions from all military activity at future climate change conferences, appointment of a Minister for Peace, guided by the UN Charter, removal of the right of veto of the 5 permanent members. integration into government policies, sustainable development goals, independent panel of legal experts to decide on arms sales, military budgets and war, diversification of large companies into other projects, and elimination of nuclear weapons. We put that to the submission to the Foreign Affairs Committee from MAW.
Thank you very much, everybody. Yeah, I think that's our time now. So hopefully we'll all get in contact with each other, and lots of people will be contacting us too. Thanks.